The Enigmatic Visitor. It was a dreary October evening when the peculiar case first came to our attention. A relentless fog had settled over London, muffling the sounds of carriage wheels on the cobbled streets of Baker Street. Holmes sat in his usual chair by the fire, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed in deep contemplation. I, on the other hand, busied myself with the evening edition of the Times, though my thoughts were frequently interrupted by my companions' occasional murmurings. "Watson, do you perceive the paradox of the commonplace?" he suddenly inquired, his sharp gaze fixing upon me with an intensity that never failed to unsettle. "Come now, Holmes, must we dwell on riddles when the evening has hardly begun?" "I heems," replied with a sigh. Before he could answer, a sharp knock at the door disrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson, ever the diligent landlady, entered with an air of mild irritation. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Insisted upon speaking with you at once. Would not take no for an answer." The door opened wider to admit a man of distinctly foreign appearance. He was of middle age, his lean frame wrapped in an expensive but travel-worn coat. A fine silk cravat of deep crimson was tied at his throat, and though his features were unmistakably of the East, his English was spoken with remarkable precision. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a low but urgent voice, "I have come to beg for your assistance in a matter of the utmost delicacy. My name is Li Sheng, and I fear I am being followed by shadows that should not exist." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the man with that unwavering gaze of his, eyes darting from the faint ink stains on his fingertips to the slight tremor in his left hand. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Pray, Mr. Sheng, tell us everything," Holmes said, "and do not omit even the smallest of details. Often it is the seemingly insignificant that unravels the most intricate of mysteries." With a weary sigh, Li Sheng settled into the chair, casting a wary glance at the curtained window, as though half expecting some unseen presence to emerge from the darkness beyond. "The shadows follow me, Mr. Holmes," he whispered, "and I fear they have already taken a life. The man from Shanghai." For a moment there was silence in the room, save for the steady ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. Holmes regarded our visitor with a peculiar expression, somewhere between intrigue and quiet amusement. He leaned forward, his fingers still steepled beneath his chin. "You speak of shadows, Mr. Sheng," he said at last, his voice measured. Most evocative phrase, but hardly precise. "I shall require something firmer than metaphor if I am to be of service." Li Sheng hesitated, his dark eyes darting once more toward the window. He seemed to be considering his words carefully, weighing each before allowing them to pass his lips. "I am a merchant by trade," he began, "or at least that is what I was before I fled Shanghai under the cover of night. My journey to England was not one of business, Mr. Holmes, but of desperation. I carry with me knowledge that some would kill to bury." Holmes exhaled sharply through his nose, as if suppressing a smile. "A bold claim, Mr. Sheng, and yet you arrived on our doorstep alone. No constables, no official escort. If you are truly in such peril, why seek me rather than the authorities?" A ghost of a smile flickered across Li Sheng's lips. "Because, Mr. Holmes, those I fear most are the authorities." I sat forward, At this, my curiosity thoroughly piqued. "Surely you don't mean British authorities?" I asked. "No," he admitted, shaking his head. "The men who pursue me serve no crown, nor wear any uniform. They are bound by oath, sworn to secrecy. In Shanghai, they are called the Hei Long, the Black Dragons. And once their eyes are set upon you, there is no escape." Holmes, who had been studying the man with the detachment of an entomologist observing an insect, suddenly reached for his pipe and began stuffing it with tobacco. He worked in silence, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. "You claim they have taken a life," he said at last. "Whose?" Sheng swallowed, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. "A man who aided me in my escape. His name was Horace Dunhill, an Englishman residing in Shanghai. A broker of sorts, one who dealt in information. He arranged my passage to England. But yesterday morning I received news that he had been found in the East End, his throat cut from ear to ear. A chill ran down my spine. 'Dear Lord,' I murmured. Holmes merely nodded, his expression unreadable. 'And how did you come by this information?' Sheng hesitated. 'An anonymous letter delivered to my lodging-house.' He reached into the folds of his coat and withdrew a small envelope, its paper creased and stained. Holmes took it with delicate fingers, extracting the single sheet within. The message was brief, written in hurried, jagged script. 'You cannot run. Dunhill thought himself safe, and now he rots. You are next.' Holmes studied the note for several long moments before folding it neatly and placing it on the table. 'Most interesting,' he murmured. 'Tell me, Mr. Sheng, do you carry anything of particular value? Some document or artifact that might explain such determined pursuit?' Li Sheng hesitated once more. Then, with great deliberation, he reached into his coat and retrieved a small lacquered box. He set it on the table between us. 'What lies within?' 'This box, Mr. Holmes,' he said gravely, 'could shake empires.' Holmes exchanged a glance with me before turning his gaze back to the mysterious man before us. 'Then, Mr. Sheng,' he said, a slow smile creeping across his lips, 'let us see what shadows truly lurk within.' The lacquered box. The small lacquered box sat upon the table like an enigma wrapped in mystery. Its black surface, polished to a high sheen, reflected the flickering firelight, giving it an almost ethereal quality. A delicate motif of golden dragons coiled along its edges, their sinuous forms twisting as if in silent guardianship of whatever lay within. Holmes reached for it, but paused just as his fingers brushed against the smooth surface. Instead, he withdrew his hand and reclined slightly in his chair, regarding Li Sheng with keen scrutiny. 'You hesitate, Mr. Sheng,' he observed. 'Despite your insistence that its contents are of paramount importance, you seem reluctant to reveal them.' Li Sheng exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping nervously against the arm of his chair. 'It is not reluctance, Mr. Holmes,' he admitted. 'It is caution. Once this box is opened, you will be drawn into something far greater than a mere murder investigation. This is a matter that extends beyond the streets of London, beyond even the reach of the British Empire.' A glimmer of excitement flickered in Holmes's sharp grey eyes. 'Now, that is a statement worthy of my attention.' With deliberate care, Li Sheng pressed his thumbs against an almost imperceptible seam in the box's surface. A faint click sounded, and the lid lifted just enough to reveal a glimpse of what lay within. Slowly, he opened it fully, turning the box so that Holmes and I could see its contents. Inside, nestled upon a bed of crimson silk, was a single sheet of parchment. The paper was old, its edges brittle with age, and covered in an intricate array of symbols and delicate brushstrokes of Chinese script. Though I could not begin to decipher it, even I could sense that it was no ordinary document. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes scanning the page with intense focus. "A scroll," he murmured. "But not just any scroll. This is a document of significance. Perhaps a historical record or a treaty." Li Sheng nodded. "It is a secret treaty, signed in the final days of the Taiping Rebellion, between certain Qing officials and a clandestine brotherhood known as the Bai Hu Men, the White Tiger Sect. It details an agreement that, if exposed, could destabilize not only China, but the entire balance of power in the East. There are those who would pay a fortune to possess it, and those who would kill to ensure it is never seen." I felt a growing unease settle in my chest. "And how, pray, did you come into possession of such a thing?" Li Sheng's expression darkened. "My family has safeguarded this document for generations, but in recent years whispers began to spread that the black dragons were hunting for it. They are the shadows I spoke of, Mr. Holmes, relentless, unseen, and merciless. When I learned that they were closing in, I had no choice but to flee." Holmes, who had remained silent throughout this explanation, suddenly reached for his magnifying glass and began examining the scroll with almost feverish intensity. "The ink composition suggests authenticity," he murmured to himself. "The calligraphy is consistent with mid-19th century documents. Watson, do you see this faint watermark?" He pointed to the lower corner of the parchment, a seal, nearly faded, but undoubtedly official. "This is no forgery." Li Sheng let out a slow breath, as if relieved by Holmes's unspoken validation. "Then you understand why I came to you," he said. "If this document falls into the wrong hands, it could be used to incite rebellion, or worse, war. And if the Black Dragons have already struck once, they will not stop until they retrieve it." Holmes placed the scroll carefully back into the box and closed the lid with a soft click. He steepled his fingers, his brow furrowed in thought. "You have placed yourself in the gravest of danger, Mr. Sheng," he said at last, "and by extension, you have placed us in danger as well." Before Li Sheng could respond, a sudden sound shattered the tense silence, a distinct thud from the window. Holmes and I turned in unison. A small black-darted projectile now quivered in the wooden frame. A warning, or a promise. Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson," he said, his voice sharp with urgency, "secure the box. We are no longer dealing in mere intrigue. This has now become a matter of life and death." The mark of the Black Dragon. For a moment, none of us moved. The room was silent but for the faint crackling of the fire. Then Holmes sprang into action. With a swiftness that belied his usual languid demeanour, he crossed the room in 3 long strides and wrenched open the window. A cold gust of October air rushed in, carrying the damp scent of London's fog. Holmes scanned the street below. his sharp eyes darting over the gaslit pavement and shadowy figures moving in the distance. "Watson, the lantern!" he ordered. I grabbed the oil lamp from the table and held it high, its flickering glow illuminating the narrow alley beyond. The street was quiet, almost deceptively so. Whoever had launched the dart was either a master of stealth or had already vanished into the night. Holmes reached up and carefully extracted the projectile from the window frame. It was a slender dart, no longer than a matchstick, its tip glistening with some dark residue. He held it up to the light, his keen eyes narrowing in recognition. "As I feared," he murmured, "a signature calling card of the Black Dragons, laced with wugong-du, a venom derived from the Chinese centipede. Had it struck flesh, the paralysis would have been instant, followed by death within minutes." Li Sheng's face paled. "They are here," he whispered, his voice thick with dread. "They have found me." "That much is evident," Holmes said dryly, turning the dart between his fingers. "And yet, this attack is uncharacteristically bold. The Black Dragons are assassins, not street ruffians. They kill in silence, unseen. For them to send a warning shot rather than striking outright suggests something peculiar." I frowned. "You believe they want something other than Mr. Sheng's life?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. If their only goal was to eliminate him, he would already be dead. Instead, they send a warning. Why? What advantage is there in alerting him to their presence?" Li Sheng shuddered. "Perhaps they wish to see if I will lead them to someone else. If they do not yet know where I have hidden the document, they may be watching, waiting for me to make a mistake." Holmes tapped the dart against his palm thoughtfully. "A reasonable theory, which means we must assume we are already under surveillance." He turned abruptly to me. "Watson, draw the curtains. We must not provide them with an easy target." I hurried to comply, pulling the heavy drapes across the window, shutting out the fog and the prying eyes of the street below. Holmes, meanwhile, took the lacquered box and placed it within the depths of his desk drawer, locking it with a turn of the key. "For the moment, this will be its safest resting place. Mr. Sheng, you must remain here under our protection. To step outside unguarded would be tantamount to suicide." Li Sheng nodded, though fear still lingered in his eyes. "I place my life in your hands, Mr. Holmes." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention once more to the dart, sniffing its tip with the careful precision of a chemist. "Curious," he muttered. "The venom is fresh. This was fired mere moments ago, meaning our assailant was watching this very room." I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. "Then they know we have the document." Holmes set the dart down. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they merely suspect. Either way, they will not stop until they have what they seek, which means we must act before they do." His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, his mind already racing ahead. Then, quite suddenly, he snapped his fingers. "Watson, prepare your revolver. I believe a visit to Limehouse is in order." I started. "Limehouse? What business have we there?" Holmes's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "The Black Dragons are formidable, but they do not operate in isolation. They have allies, informants, and there is one particular gentleman in Limehouse who may shed some light on their movements." I caught the faintest glimmer of excitement in his eyes, the unmistakable thrill of the chase. "Come, Watson," he said, rising from his chair. "The game has begun." Into the fog of Limehouse. The night air was thick with mist as Holmes and I made our way through the labyrinthine streets of Limehouse, the heart of London's Chinatown. The gas lamps cast feeble pools of light upon the wet cobblestones, their glow swallowed by the swirling fog that clung to the narrow alleyways. The scent of the Thames mingled with opium smoke and the brine of freshly unloaded cargo hung heavy in the air. Holmes walked with purpose, his tall frame barely visible in the gloom, while I kept one hand firmly on the revolver in my coat pocket. Limehouse was a district known for its secrets, and I had no desire to be caught unprepared. "Who is this man we are meeting, Holmes?" I asked in a hushed voice. "A most resourceful individual," Holmes replied, his tone edged with amusement. "Ah Ping is what one might call a professional listener. He hears things others do not, and for the right price he is willing to share them." We turned a corner and found ourselves in a dimly lit alleyway. At the far end stood a nondescript wooden door, its surface scarred by years of neglect. Holmes rapped on it 3 times in quick succession. A moment later, a small panel slid open, revealing a pair of sharp, almond-shaped eyes. The gaze lingered on Holmes before shifting to me, scrutinizing every detail of my face and attire. Then, without a word, the panel snapped shut, and the door creaked open just wide enough for us to slip inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the acrid scent of incense. A dozen figures sat at low tables, their faces partially obscured by curling tendrils of opium smoke. In the farthest corner of the room, a man reclined on a silk cushion, idly turning a jade ring between his fingers. Ah Ping. Holmes strode toward him without hesitation, settling himself on the opposite cushion with the ease of a man who belonged in any room he entered. I remained standing, my unease growing. Ah Ping regarded Holmes with a slow, knowing smile. "It is not often that Sherlock Holmes graces my humble establishment," he murmured in lightly accented English. "You must be in need of something rare." Holmes inclined his head. "Information, specifically regarding a certain society that operates in the shadows." Ah Ping's smile did not falter, but there was a glint of wariness in his eyes. "London has many shadows, Mr. Holmes. You must be more specific." Holmes leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough that only we could hear. "The Black Dragons." The effect was immediate. The smile vanished, and the room, which had moments ago been alive with murmured conversation, seemed to grow unnaturally still. Even those lost in the depths of opium-induced stupor shifted slightly, as if the very mention of the name carried weight. Ah Ping exhaled softly. "A dangerous inquiry," he said, "the kind that leads to short lives." Holmes remained unmoved. "And yet you know something." Ah Ping's fingers continued their slow rotation of the jade ring. A test, I realized. A subtle means of buying time to decide whether speaking was worth the risk. Finally, he said, "The Black Dragons do not act openly. They move like mist, unseen until it is too late. But there are whispers, A man arrived in Limehouse 2 days ago, asking questions about an artifact of great value. Holmes's gaze sharpened. What kind of artifact? Ah Ping shrugged. A document, or so the whispers say. Something that should not be in this country. His dark eyes flicked toward me, and now you, too, are searching for it. Which means that whatever this is, it is worth more than gold. Holmes's fingers drummed lightly against the tabletop. And the man who sought this information, was he Chinese? Ah Ping shook his head. No, English. A man of wealth, from the sound of it. He did not come himself, of course. Men like him never do. But his messenger was indiscreet. My heart quickened. Then the black dragons are not the only ones after the document. Ah Ping gave a slow nod. No, Doctor. There is another player in this game, and from what I hear, he is willing to kill for it. A new threat. A hidden adversary. The case had just become even more dangerous. Holmes, however, merely smiled. Most illuminating, Ah Ping. And where, pray, might we find this messenger? Ah Ping hesitated. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he indicated a figure at the far end of the room. A man slumped in a chair, his back to us, a hat pulled low over his face. Holmes rose smoothly to his feet. Come, Watson. It appears we have found our next clue. A messenger's fate. Holmes moved toward the slumped figure with measured steps, his sharp gaze absorbing every detail. The slight tilt of the hat, the stillness of the body, the way the left hand rested unnaturally on the table. I followed, closely, my pulse quickening with each step. Ah Ping's establishment had grown silent, as if the entire room sensed that something unnatural had taken place. Holmes stopped just short of the man's chair. With the tip of his finger, he nudged the hat back slightly. The man did not move. Holmes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached for the wrist that lay limp on the table and turned it over. A thin red mark encircled the pale skin just above the sleeve. A garrote wound. He is dead, Holmes murmured, his voice unreadable. I bent down for a closer examination, my years of medical practice taking over. The skin was cool to the touch, the veins already showing the faint marbling that spoke of early rigour. I loosened his collar slightly and found what I had feared, a deep ligature mark running across his throat. Strangled? I confirmed, grimly. Not more than an hour ago, I'd wager. Holmes nodded. And his killer, most likely among the very people who saw us enter this room. A slow realization settled over me. The murderer had been here, perhaps still was. Ah Ping, still seated at his table, showed no outward reaction, but his fingers stilled on the jade ring. Unfortunate, he murmured. It seems you were too late, Mr. Holmes. Holmes, however, was not so easily deterred. His hands moved swiftly, searching the dead man's coat pockets. He retrieved a crumpled scrap of paper and smoothed it out on the table. A single line of writing adorned the page, scrawled in a hurried, uneven hand. Pier number 17, midnight. I felt a chill settle over me. Holmes. If this note was meant for him, then, he was likely on his way to meet someone when he was silenced. Precisely, Holmes said, slipping the note into his pocket. which means the killer may already be en route to Pier 17, or worse, lying in wait. Ah Ping exhaled slowly. I have no love for the black dragons, but you should be careful, Mr. Holmes. If you continue down this path, you will make enemies you cannot see. Holmes smiled faintly. That has never stopped me before. He turned sharply toward the door. Come, Watson, we must reach Pier 17 before midnight. I followed without question, though I could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes followed our every move. As we stepped out into the fog-shrouded streets of Limehouse, the night seemed heavier, filled with the weight of secrets waiting to be unearthed. The shadows at the dock. The damp night air clung to us as Holmes and I made our way toward the Thames, our footsteps echoing against the empty cobblestone streets. Limehouse was silent at this hour, save for the distant creak of moored ships and the occasional splash of water against the pier. The city's ever-present fog thickened as we approached the docks, curling around the gas lamps like ghostly fingers. Pier 17 loomed ahead, its wooden planks stretching over the murky river. A single lantern hung from a rusted post, its dim glow barely illuminating the dock. The air smelled of salt, damp wood, and something else, something metallic. Holmes stopped abruptly. He raised a gloved hand, signalling me to do the same. "Do you smell it, Watson?" he murmured. I took a cautious breath. Yes, blood. Holmes nodded, and fresh. He moved forward with feline grace, his keen eyes sweeping the area. I followed, revolver in hand, my nerves taut as a violin string. Near the base of the lantern, a figure lay sprawled against a wooden crate. A man dressed in a long overcoat, his face turned away from us. Even before Holmes crouched beside the body, I knew the truth. Another murder. Holmes carefully turned the man's head. The victim was young, no older than 30, with dark hair and a trimmed moustache. His throat bore the same telltale ligature mark as the man in Ah Ping's opium den. But this time there was something else, something Holmes examined with great interest. Pinned to the man's coat was a small black silk token embroidered with a silver dragon. Holmes's expression darkened. The mark of the black dragons. I exhaled sharply. Then he was one of them? Undoubtedly, Holmes murmured. But the question is, was he the killer from the opium den, or was he silenced before he could reveal something of value? I glanced around uneasily. Holmes, if the black dragons have begun eliminating their own, it means the situation is growing more dangerous. Whoever is orchestrating this wants to ensure there are no loose ends. Holmes nodded, his gaze flicking over the corpse once more, before rising to his feet. And yet, Watson, there is something curious about this particular loose end. I frowned. What do you mean? Holmes motioned toward the ground near the dead man's hand. A trail of smeared ink led to a single object half submerged in the damp wood. A notebook. Holmes plucked it up, careful not to disturb the pages too much. The cover was plain, unmarked, but when he flipped it open, his sharp eyes gleamed with interest. The pages were filled with hurried scrawls of Chinese characters, interspersed with occasional English words. Shipment confirmed. Document in transit. Instructions pending. Before I could inquire further, the sound of footsteps echoed from the darkness. Slow, deliberate. Holmes stiffened. "We are not alone, Watson." I gripped my revolver tighter. The mist swirled, and from the shadows 3 figures emerged. Tall, cloaked in black, their faces obscured by the dim light. One stepped forward and spoke in a smooth, accented voice. "Mr. Holmes, you are interfering in matters beyond your comprehension." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, my comprehension extends quite well into the realm of organized crime and assassination, though I do appreciate the warning." The man took another step forward. "Hand over the notebook." Holmes tucked it into his coat. "I'm afraid I cannot oblige. You see, I have rather developed an attachment to it." A flicker of movement, one of the men reaching inside his coat. A weapon? A blade? I did not wait to find out. "Holmes!" I shouted, raising my revolver. The night exploded into motion. A game of shadows. The moment my voice rang out, the 3 cloaked figures sprang into action. Holmes moved first. Swift, precise, grabbing my arm and pulling me backward, just as a gleaming blade slashed through the air where we had stood. The sound of steel on wood echoed as the knife embedded itself into the dock-post, quivering from the force of the throw. I barely had time to raise my revolver before another attacker lunged forward. Holmes, ever the master of anticipation, shifted to meet him, deflecting the strike with a deft movement of his cane. The clash was brief but telling. These men were trained fighters, disciplined and deadly. I fired a shot into the air, the sound reverberating across the fog-laden Thames. It was not meant to hit, but rather to disrupt, and it worked. The nearest figure hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough time for Holmes to exploit. With a sharp twist, he wrenched the attacker's arm and sent him sprawling onto the wooden planks. The man let out a choked grunt as his head struck the dock. The second assailant was more relentless. He reached for something within his coat, another weapon perhaps, but Holmes was faster. In one fluid motion, he jabbed the man's wrist with the tip of his cane, forcing him to drop whatever he had concealed. A small vial rolled onto the dock, shattering as it hit the wood. A pungent scent filled the air. Chloroform. A convenient way to silence one's enemies, Holmes remarked, sidestepping as the final attacker lunged again. I took my chance, levelling my revolver at the man. "Hold it!" I barked. For a tense moment, the figure hesitated. The fog swirled between us, thick and oppressive, and I could see only the glint of his narrowed eyes beneath the hood. Then, as swiftly as they had come, the remaining 2 men turned and bolted toward the darkness beyond the pier. Holmes made to follow, but I placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Holmes, no! We don't know how many more may be waiting beyond the docks." Holmes exhaled sharply, watching as the figures melted into the mist. Then he turned his attention to the unconscious man at our feet. "Quite right, Watson," he admitted, "but no matter. We have one left behind." I knelt beside the downed attacker, pressing 2 fingers to his pulse. It was steady, though he remained dazed from the blow. Holmes crouched beside me, his gaze sharp. With practiced efficiency, he slipped a hand into the man's coat and withdrew a folded scrap of paper. He unfolded it, his eyes narrowing as he read the contents. A list of names. Some crossed out. At the very bottom, I saw something that sent a shiver through me. Sherlock Holmes. "Charming," Holmes murmured, lips twitching in amusement. Seems I have been promoted from nuisance to target. I swallowed hard. Holmes, if your name is on this list, then these men are not merely interested in secrecy. They intend to eliminate anyone who stands in their way. Holmes pocketed the note. So it would seem. He glanced at the unconscious man. But perhaps our new friend here will be able to shed some light on matters once he regains consciousness. A distant whistle sounded through the fog, the unmistakable call of the river police, likely drawn by the gunshot. Holmes stood abruptly. "Time to go, Watson. We shall continue this interrogation in a more controlled environment." I needed no further urging. We vanished into the mist, leaving behind the docks, the bloodstains, and the lingering scent of danger. The interrogation! We hurried through the shrouded streets of Limehouse, the damp air clinging to our coats as we navigated the labyrinthine alleys. Holmes, ever precise, had ensured that our unconscious captive was supported just enough to appear, like a drunken man escorted home by two companions. The ruse spared us from unwanted attention. At last, we reached Baker Street. The familiar gaslit glow of 221B welcomed us like a sanctuary against the dangers of the night. Mrs. Hudson, though, startled by our unexpected return with an unconscious man, had long since learned not to question Holmes's methods. Once inside, we deposited the man into a chair, binding his wrists securely with Holmes's silk cravat. It did not take long for the man to stir. His eyes flickered open, first unfocused, then sharpening with recognition as they settled upon Holmes. "You are awake, I see," Holmes observed coolly. He took his customary seat by the fireplace, steepling his fingers. I trust your head is not too unpleasant?" The man blinked once, then set his jaw defiantly. He was young, with sharp features and the hardened expression of one accustomed to danger. His black cloak was now dishevelled, the silver dragon, emblem upon his sleeve partially obscured by the bindings. Holmes regarded him with mild amusement. "Come now, my good fellow, there is no need for theatrics. We both know that silence will not serve you here." The man remained motionless, his dark eyes betraying no emotion. Holmes sighed. "Very well. Watson, if you would be so kind as to retrieve my monograph on Chinese secret societies." I nodded, stepping toward the bookshelf. At that moment, the captive spoke. "There is no need," he said, his voice smooth, accented, and carefully measured. Holmes's lips twitched. "Ah, so you do have a tongue after all? Splendid." The man exhaled slowly. "You should not have interfered, Mr. Holmes." Holmes chuckled, an oft-repeated sentiment, yet one I have never found persuasive. He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what is your name?" The man hesitated, then relented. "Jin Hao." Holmes nodded approvingly. "A pleasure. Now, Jin Hao, let us speak plainly. You are an agent of the Black Dragons, are you not?" Jin Hao did not answer, but the flicker in his gaze betrayed him. Holmes continued. "I believe your superiors sent you to eliminate a loose end tonight, and yet, rather than executing your task cleanly, you and your associates found yourselves outmaneuvered. Most unfortunate." Jin Hao's expression darkened. "You think this is a victory for you, Mr. Holmes? You have placed yourself in a game where you do not belong." Holmes's smile did not waver. "And yet, here we are." He tapped his fingers together. "Now, let us discuss the notebook." Jin Hao's fingers twitched involuntarily. Holmes caught the movement at once. Ah, that struck a nerve. He retrieved the notebook from his coat, holding it up between two fingers. "I suspect this contains information that your organization would rather not see in the wrong hands. Would you care to enlighten me?" Jin Hao said nothing. Holmes sighed theatrically. "Very well. Let us hypothesize. This notebook contains records, shipments, transactions, movements of certain interested parties. And if I were to hazard a guess, I would say that the Black Dragons are engaged in a rather lucrative smuggling operation." Jin Hao's lips pressed into a thin line. Holmes pressed on. "Opium, undoubtedly. Perhaps arms as well, and you—" he gestured toward Jin Hao, "were responsible for ensuring that these affairs remained undisturbed." Jin Hao's gaze remained locked on Holmes, unreadable. Holmes leaned back. But then something changed. A disruption. Someone betrayed the organization or threatened to expose it. He tapped the notebook. "Which brings us to this. The question, Jin Hao, is simple. Who was the leak?" For a long moment the room was silent, save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Then, at last, Jin Hao exhaled. "You believe you are clever, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly. "But you do not yet understand the full picture." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." Jin Hao's expression remained impassive. "You are looking in the wrong place." Holmes studied him carefully. "Am I?" Jin Hao nodded. "The leak was not one of us." His voice lowered slightly. "It came from within your own people." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes's fingers tapped against his armrest. "Interesting." Jin Hao leaned forward slightly. "Turn back now, Mr. Holmes. If you continue down this path, you will uncover something even you may wish had remained hidden." Holmes smiled. "My dear Jin Hao, that is precisely why I must continue." Jin Hao's eyes gleamed. "Then you are already doomed." The clock struck midnight. Outside in the streets of London, a shadow passed beneath the gaslight, watching, waiting. The betrayal within. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows upon the walls of 200B Baker Street. The scent of tobacco and damp London fog hung in the air as Holmes regarded Jin Hao with an unreadable expression. The man's final words, "The leak was not one of us," had shifted the case into a far more treacherous direction. I sat stiffly, my mind racing through the implications. Someone within our own circles had betrayed vital information to the Black Dragons. But who? Scotland Yard? The British government? Someone we had spoken to in the course of our investigation? Holmes tapped his fingers rhythmically against the arm of his chair. "You are aware, Jin Hao, that your cryptic warnings only serve to deepen my resolve." Jin Hao smirked. "I expected nothing less." Holmes narrowed his gaze. "Tell me, does this traitor act for personal gain, or is there another motive?" Jin Hao tilted his head slightly, considering. "Perhaps both." Holmes sighed. "How delightfully vague." Jin Hao gave a faint chuckle. "It is all you will get from me, Mr. Holmes." Holmes studied him for a moment longer, then abruptly rose from his chair. "Very well. Watson, Would you be so kind as to summon Inspector Lestrade? Our guest here will be spending the evening in Scotland Yard's hospitality." Jin Hao's expression darkened, but he said nothing as I left to send a messenger. When I returned, Holmes stood by the window, staring into the misty street below. He did not turn as he spoke. "Watson, there is a carriage parked just beyond the lamplight. It has been there for nearly an hour." I joined him, peering out into the gloom. A dark carriage sat motionless at the edge of visibility, its driver barely discernible in the shadows. Holmes continued, "Someone is watching us, waiting for an opportunity. The black dragons do not abandon their own so easily." A faint clatter echoed from below. I tensed. They would not dare an attack here, would they? Holmes's eyes gleamed. "No, but they may have other means of intervention." At that moment, a sharp crack rang through the night. The window pane beside us shattered. I barely had time to react before Holmes grabbed my shoulder and yanked me down. A small dart-like object clattered to the floor where my head had been. Holmes retrieved it carefully with a handkerchief. The tip glistened with a clear substance. "Poison," he murmured. "Subtle, silent, and most effective. A warning shot, no doubt." Jin Hao chuckled from his chair. "They are growing impatient, Mr. Holmes." Holmes pocketed the dart. "Yes, which means we are getting close." Moments later, a sharp rap sounded at the door. I exhaled with relief as Mrs. Hudson's voice carried up the stairs. "Inspector Lestrade is here, Mr. Holmes." Holmes glanced at Jin Hao. "It seems your accommodations for the evening are secured." Jin Hao smiled faintly. I'm making a mistake, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gave him a knowing look. "That remains to be seen." As Lestrade entered with 2 constables, Holmes turned to me. His voice was calm, but his eyes held an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "Watson, we have very little time. The real mastermind is about to make their next move." The mastermind's move. Inspector Lestrade stood in the doorway, his sharp gaze flicking between Holmes, Jin Hao, and the shattered window. "By heavens, Holmes, are you under attack?" Holmes gestured toward the poisoned dart resting on the table. "A simple attempt at silencing us, Lestrade. Fortunately, their marksmanship leaves much to be desired." Lestrade scowled, signalling to the constables, "Take this man to Scotland Yard. We'll see if he's still so smug after a night in a cell." The officers stepped forward, untying Jin Hao's restraints and hoisting him to his feet. He did not struggle. Instead, he regarded Holmes with an eerie calm. "They are watching, Mr. Holmes. You have already lost." Holmes offered him a small smile. "On the contrary, my dear, Jin Hao, the game has only just begun." With a nod from Lestrade, the constables escorted the prisoner out into the foggy night. The moment the door closed, Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Watson, time is of the essence. Our adversary now knows we have Jin Hao in custody, which means they will attempt to act before he can be questioned properly." I frowned. "You suspect an attack on Scotland Yard?" Holmes shook his head. "No, that would be too overt. Instead, they will eliminate the need for such an attack by ensuring Jin Hao does not live long enough to speak." Lestrade scoffed. "Holmes, my men will keep him under watch. No one's getting in or out without my say-so." Holmes turned to him, eyes gleaming. "Lestrade, I admire your confidence, but consider this. If someone within your ranks has been leaking information to the Black Dragons, then the threat does not come from outside Scotland Yard. It comes from within. Lestrade's jaw tightened. You think one of my men is working with them? Holmes nodded. It would explain how they have remained ahead of us thus far. Lestrade exhaled sharply. Blast it, Holmes. If what you're saying is true, then we've just handed Jinhao over to his executioners. Holmes grabbed his coat. Precisely why we must get to Scotland Yard before it is too late. A desperate race. The carriage ride was tense, the horses' hooves pounding against the damp cobblestones as we sped toward Scotland Yard. The city outside was eerily quiet, the mist rolling thick through the streets. Holmes sat with his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed ahead in deep concentration. Lestrade, on the other hand, drummed his fingers against his knee, his frustration barely concealed. I don't like this, Holmes, he muttered. The idea that one of my own men could be involved. It is not a matter of liking Lestrade. It is a matter of fact. Holmes interrupted. We must consider who had access to the information regarding Jinhao's capture. Lestrade exhaled. Only a handful of people, myself, my sergeant, and a few officers on night duty. Holmes's eyes glimmered. Then we need only determine which among them had the opportunity and the motive. The carriage jolted to a sudden stop. Lestrade frowned. Why are we stopping? The driver's muffled voice called back. A carriage ahead, sir. It's blocking the road. Holmes and I exchanged glances. Watson, he murmured, I believe our enemies have decided to take a more direct approach. A figure stepped from the mist. A tall man in a dark coat, his face obscured beneath the brim of his hat. More figures emerged from the fog, their silhouettes shifting like wraiths in the lamplight. We were surrounded. Lestrade cursed, reaching for his revolver. A trap! Holmes remained perfectly still, his lips curving ever so slightly. Indeed, Watson, it seems our opponent has finally revealed their hand. The leader of the group stepped forward, his voice a low, measured whisper. Mr. Holmes, you have interfered for the last time. The clock struck midnight. The final move had begun. The final move. The gaslights flickered weakly in the dense London fog as the figures encircled us, their intent clear. Holmes, unruffled as ever, observed them with a calculating gaze. Lestrade, his revolver drawn, was tense beside me. The leader of the group stepped forward, his face emerging from the gloom. A tall man with a sharp, aristocratic bearing, his dark eyes gleamed with cruel amusement beneath the brim of his hat. Holmes inclined his head. Ah, Lord Edwin Cavendish. Lestrade stiffened. Cavendish? But he's a respected official in the Foreign Office. Cavendish's lips curled into a smirk. And that, Inspector, is precisely why no one suspected me. I felt a chill. A traitor within the British establishment itself. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. You were the one feeding the Black Dragons information. That is how they knew of every step we took. Cavendish chuckled. Indeed, Mr. Holmes, a convenient arrangement. My position granted me access to sensitive intelligence, trade routes, opium shipments, diplomatic movements. In exchange, the Black Dragons ensured that certain delicate matters remained undisrupted. Lestrade's grip on his revolver tightened. "You're a damned traitor!" Cavendish sighed. "Such harsh words, Inspector. I merely sought to profit from an inevitable reality. The East belongs to those with power, and soon Britain will have no choice but to yield." Holmes shook his head. "Spare me your justifications, Lord Cavendish. You betray your country not out of ideology, but for personal gain." Cavendish's smile thinned. "Enough talk. You know too much, Holmes. It is regrettable but necessary that you and your companions disappear tonight." At his signal, the men around us stepped forward, hands reaching for concealed weapons. Holmes exhaled. "Lestrade, if you would be so kind." Lestrade gave a sharp whistle. Instantly, whistles and shouts echoed from the mist. From the rooftops and alleys, uniformed officers emerged, revolvers drawn. The Black Dragon's men hesitated. "Too long." "Drop your weapons!" Lestrade barked. Panic erupted. The criminals, realizing their ambush had turned against them, tried to flee, but Scotland Yard had the streets locked down. Within moments, the majority were subdued, disarmed, and shackled. Cavendish made a desperate move, drawing a small pistol from his coat. But before he could fire, Holmes stepped forward in a blur of movement, striking his wrist with the precision of a duelist. The pistol clattered to the cobblestones. Cavendish staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. Holmes dusted off his gloves. "I anticipated an ambush, Lord Cavendish, which is why I sent a messenger ahead to Scotland Yard before we even left Baker Street." Lestrade seized Cavendish by the collar. "You'll be answering for treason, you snake." Cavendish's expression darkened, but he said nothing as he was dragged away with the rest of his men. Epilogue. A case concluded. Back at 2B Baker Street, the fire crackled warmly as Holmes stood by the window, gazing into the misty streets. I poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to him. "A remarkable case," I mused, "and a dangerous one." Holmes took a contemplative sip. "Indeed, Watson, but every move was calculated. The Black Dragons are dismantled, their British accomplice exposed. Justice has prevailed." I chuckled. "You make it sound so simple." Holmes smirked. "Simplicity, my dear Watson, is merely the final result of well-applied logic." I raised my glass. "To logic, then." He clinked his glass against mine. "To the game, Watson, and the fact that it never truly ends." The clock struck 1. The case of the Shadows of the Orient was closed.